G'day, welcome to the Financial Bloke Podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. Today we're doing something a little different. We've got Senator Susan McDonald here to give us her take on the current foot and mouth disease situation and politically how the agricultural industry can tackle the problem. For those of you who don't know Susan, she grew up on a family's cattle property near Cloncurry in far north Queensland. She went to boarding school in Brisbane and then went on to study and work in the accounting industry. She worked as a chief of staff for the then Natural Resources Minister, Andrew Cripps, and eventually purchased a chain of butcher shops in Brisbane and the Gold Coast and ran them for 6 years before she decided to take the plunge into politics and was elected to the Australian Senate for Queensland. Susan's the Shadow Minister for Resources and for Northern Australia and the Chairman of the Federal Government's Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Committee. Now Susan's working bloody hard at raising awareness and we need to support her efforts. So if you can please share this episode with everyone you know, and also if you're a member or involved with any industry associations, ask them to share with all their members. We need to be as vocal as we can and sharing this podcast will help do that. So without further delay, welcome Susan and thanks for joining me today.
Hello, Ben.
So I know your time's really, really precious, and so I'd like to get stuck into things. But the first question I'd basically like to ask for everyone is, this seems like a really obvious answer, but can you tell me in your opinion why foot and mouth disease is such a major problem for the whole country, not just the rural producers out there?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, Ben, because when we talk about foot and mouth, lumpy skin disease and other biosecurity risks, it always seems to be about the risk to the farmer and their produce. And of course, that's not the case. So I used to be a butcher and run butcher shops before I got into politics. And I can tell you that the impact of foot and mouth and lumpy skin disease in Australia would drive up the cost of meat, it would drive up the cost of milk, drive up the cost of pork. And in the very worst case situation, if we had to stop the movement of animals for a significant period of time, we may not have product on the shelves. It's a really shocking thing for Australians to think about because we've always had, incredible food security. Even during COVID, we were able to mobilise the transport businesses and able to get food delivered. I may not have had toilet paper, but we've had food on the shelves. So, this is really important that for all of Australia that we understand that the risk is not just about animal health, because lumpy skin and FMD are both really cruel diseases. They don't kill, it's not the mortality of the disease, it's the morbidity that comes from not being able to feed, not being able to drink. And so the impacts in a country like Australia with big rangelands operations would be devastating for the animals. It would be devastating for graziers and farmers and their mental health, particularly if they had to be destroying stock that was not sick in a quarantine zone. But again, for consumers would see higher cost of food. They would see shortages of those particular products. We'd have to start considering if we were going to import products from overseas at a very, very worst case scenario. So, we should all be very aware of it. And there are tens of thousands of jobs that are associated with agriculture right across Australia. Whether it's the butchers and abattoir workers, people who drive the trucks, people who do the marketing, the impact would be much further afield than just on, far-flung cattle stations and feedlots.
And I think there's also the part that we also forget is we're a net exporter of a lot of meat products. And of course, that will obviously impact countries overseas and will then have a knock-on effect to some of the poorest countries in the world who are mostly starving for not only normal food, but protein is a fairly big problem. And so there's this knock-on effect. So anyone cares about the poorest of the world, it's also a major problem for them as well.
Well, that's right. And the US Secretary of State Blinken talked at the World Peace Conference recently about a looming food shortage in the world. And Australia contributes to people having food, to our near neighbours, having food security. Wars are fought over food security. So, the consequence of getting foot and mouth or lumpy skin into Australia are really significant. And that's why we should do everything and anything possible to keep it off our shores and keep our biosecurity borders strong.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. It's stopping it getting in the country rather than dealing with the problem once it gets here. So before I did this podcast, I decided to contact a number of producers because I thought, I really want to understand what people are worried about on the ground. And one of those was my dad, who was quite vocal about his questions. There are a lot of issues raised, but I think they can all be represented by one word, which is urgency. There was that real sense of there's a fear around that there's a lack of urgency. And I can see the problem that every week there's a new crisis. There's a crisis of the climate crisis, the financial crisis. There's all these crises, and both public servants and citizens alike are suffering from, crisis fatigue. People just start to switch off. So I suppose what I'm trying to say, Susan, is to cut the wheat from the chaff. Do you feel there's an appropriate level of, I suppose you say, urgency from government leaders and department bureaucrats at this point in time? And that was the major question from a lot of people.
Well, no, I don't. So foot and mouth is a disease that's been in other countries around the world, India and Vietnam and others, South America, the famous outbreak in the UK in 2001. But it has never been as close to us in the sort of numbers that it is now. And particularly somewhere like Bali, where we have nearly 1 million people a year travelling between Australia and Bali. They are coming back in thongs. They've dragged their suitcase through the streets. They might have bought some food samples that they enjoyed over there, and that's all pouring back into Australia. So it's 3 weeks tomorrow since the outbreak was discovered in Bali, and I think that's changed the playing field. So we're now 3 weeks into this. We're only just moving to put down disinfectant pads. We haven't moved to stopping food coming in with passengers. The Northern Territory can manage it. They've got big bins at the airport. Just leave all your snacks here. We are still working on the vaccination program. So roughly about 700,000 vaccinations for foot and mouth have been given. Nothing like that number for lumpy skin disease. But remembering that Indonesia is its own sovereign country. We can't march in there and demand, all we can do is provide support and aid to allow them to do this. And I think we need to be doing more of that. But more importantly is our front line, our front door, thinking about what are the messages that we've got. When you see people going into New Zealand, they talk about people who've had contact with grass and soil, and they ask that it's not just if you've been on a farm, but if you've been in that sort of environment. We still talk about, have you been on a farm? Well, if you're a tourist who's gone to stay in Bali, 25% of the 143,000 people who went to Bali last month, 23% stay in a private residence. That private residence might have the hosts, the people who are running that at 6 o'clock in the morning on their farm caring for their sick pig, and then at 8 o'clock in the morning cooking breakfast for the Australians who are about to go back and get a plane back to Australia. That's the kind of transfer risk that is different to where we are in other countries. So it means that we have got to be focusing on making our biosecurity of every person who comes into this country, that they understand what their risk is. We stop talking about farms. We talk about grass and soil. We talk about footwear. We talk about definitely no food products coming into the country. And unless we are really confident that we're getting that right, then we're betting the farm.
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode. Appreciate that. And so why don't you think there is an urgency? I mean, to me, it just seems when you look at it past the farmer and you look at the impact on our economic position, plus the impact on the poorest of our community and internationally, it just seems like a no-brainer that there should be someone running around with alarm bells going, we need to be doing something here. Why do you think there's no real enough of a sense of urgency, do you think?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. I think that the structure of government has changed. We used to have a lot of DPI officers and more vets employed in government. So if you think about Queensland, the numbers of people who are involved from a government level in the BTEC program, the brucellosis and tuberculosis program of the 70s and 80s, we don't have that land-based element that would be in departments right now, saying exactly how concerned they are. So we're missing some of that expertise and that regional connection. I think there is a sense of fatigue, as you say, particularly having just had 2 years of coronavirus and every other crisis that we talk about. And I think that over generations, we've become very used to talking about Australia's clean, green image, our great biosecurity, our disease-free status. And I'm not sure that we're really ready to think about what the potential risks are. So, there are a lot of people, the Ag Minister's talking about how passionate he is on this issue, how concerned he is, but I'm not sure that he's really infecting the department officials with those thoughts, and certainly not to the level that farmers would hope.
Yeah, and it seems to me whenever you deal with a government department, and I just want to say I know a whole lot of people that work in government departments, and there's great people.
Absolutely.
But we all know that the way the bureaucracy works is that there's obviously multiple departments involved. I'm guessing there's, the Department of Trade, Department of Ag, Biosecurity, Foreign Affairs. There's probably a huge amount, and nobody seems to be the one organisation that spearheads this. So I suppose my next two questions that come to mind would be, do we actually have a solid plan that people can follow? So in other words, this happens, we bring out the playbook and we say, okay, really smart people have worked through this. This is what we're going to do. And then someone's in control of that. So almost like a responsible entity or a commander-in-chief. Do we have those two things, Susan, or are we just flying by the seat of our pants, do you think?
No, there has been a lot of planning done over years, and certainly people like the Vets Association who, have lived through the UK outbreak, have lived through other biosecurity issues, and, even this week they're wargaming a potential outbreak here. So that, that's happening. Graziers and farmers would be, dusting off their own biosecurity plans and thinking about, what would it look like? People coming onto their farms, would they be quarantining people? I know some farms are now starting to look at school groups and saying, perhaps we should be thinking about, who comes onto their property while we think about this, and just assure ourselves that we have the most secure plan in place. But no, I think you can feel confident that this has been thought about. It's just the reality that though nobody cares as much as the people whose families and children and generations of seed stock and pasture improvements and certainly the big fat mortgage, nothing animates people more than the ones who are literally at the front line in that regard. So, I think that's another element.
Okay. And so who is ultimately in charge of spearheading the defence of this, I suppose you'd say? Is it a specific department? Is it a person? Who's responsible, I suppose?
Yeah. Well, at the moment, it's the Department of Agriculture and the Minister. The Chief Vet, Dr. Mark Shipp, is very involved in that. But there's lots of elements. You identified the Department of Trade. You identified Home Affairs. There's lots of elements of the government that has inputs into this. But at the end of the day, it is the Department of Agriculture that has oversight for biosecurity.
Okay. And so it falls, I suppose you'd say, on their shoulders to be making sure these biosecurity measures, like you mentioned, footbaths as an example, at the airports, educating people coming back in and keeping things a lot safer. Because I know the issue that was raised by a few people was coming back from overseas, feeling like there's not an appropriate sense of safety I should say. And I remember I had an experience of that back in, I think it was 2005. I'd been living in London, working in London. I'd been on my dad's uncle's dairy farm over there. They'd had mad cow disease and foot and mouth and all those sorts of things. And I remember when I got back to border, I said, I've cleaned these boots to the in an inch of their lives, but I'd like to get them inspected and cleaned extra. And they said, don't worry about it, off you go. And I think that's what people are concerned about is we should be hitting it right there and then, not letting those things, because it only takes one person to have dirty boots, dirty thongs, whatever, and next thing you know, it's all over.
Well, a friend of mine from a station in far north Queensland went to the US the other day. They arrived in the US. Australia is a disease-free country for the purposes of the US, and he said that he'd been on a farm in Australia. They opened the suitcase, they redid the boots, they examined everything. We need that same sense of discipline that we treat everybody. And it's not just the visitors from Bali. If we are serious about maintaining disease-free status, then we have to get more serious about it, I believe. And, this is, again, the responsibility of the Ag Minister to not just be passionate about it and be talking to his department every day, but to be demanding that it be demonstrated to him what steps are being taken. So a week after the FMD outbreak in Bali, I was still chasing a copy of the flyer to see what it was that was being handed out on planes. It's just so unsuitable for a 25-year-old young person who's been over to Bali to surf and maybe have a cultural experience, drink Mai Tais on the beach, because it had a picture of steel-capped muddy boots. Had a pictures of other things that I don't think would trigger them to think, I should be taking action. And again, this is crisis management 101 for a business, is you think about what's the risk, so what is the level of steps that we're going to take, but you're also looking at, well, what is it that we're doing on the ground? What is our ground game? And that is the bit that I think that we have some great plans, but on the ground, are we executing it as well as every grazier, farmer, butcher and consumer in Australia would expect that we are? And that's my question. I don't believe we are. And so implementations of those plans, the responsibility of the Agricultural Minister, I think that's a bit that's missing, is just this attention to detail. We're probably under-resourced. We've got a shortage of skills across this country in every sector you can think of. So I just think we've got to be using physical prompts like the disinfectant mats, like changing the forms, like putting bins out and demanding that all food being brought in, because that is actually the greatest risk. The greatest risk is somebody bringing in a pork sausage or something that the family's cooked for them and not properly heated through. That is the greatest risk of us bringing disease into this country.
It's interesting. I remember hearing a statement years ago. I can't remember where it was from, but it was something along the lines of the difference between a recession and a depression is that a recession is where someone else loses their job. A depression is where you lose your job. And I think that's a little bit of the probably rings true here for me, is that for the vast majority of Australians is they just don't get the problem until it lands on their doorstep. They go down to Woolworths and or the butcher shop and there's no meat, or they find that meat's now no longer X amount of dollars, it's 2 times the amount. And so is there any drive to be able to provide some sort of awareness or education through the media or online or things like that, so the younger people that are travelling and the rest of the community understands how important this is?
Yeah.
Or is this something that will come as we evolve?
Well, I think that has happened. I think that you're seeing this being well articulated through all the major media outlets. It's on Facebook pages and Instagram. There's certainly announcements at airports now. So, I think we are doing a better job at that. I think it's interesting, though, that we've just lived through COVID. When COVID first started, with an unvaccinated population, similar to our animal herd, we threw everything. We threw everything at stopping COVID because we knew that we were unprepared to have the infection sweep through the country. We know that if you have lived in the UK while the CJD outbreak was on, you can't give blood. That was 20 years ago, because we have identified that as a risk. and we've said, well, the step we're going to take is to ban people giving blood to prevent that from being an unintended consequence of a transfusion. There are other things where we take steps based on what we perceive the risk to be. The risk for foot and mouth is significant. It's currently set at 18%.
That's what we're projecting is the chance of this getting into Australia. That's significant, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? You and I think it's significant. It's 1 in 5. The government is saying, well, it's not very significant. It's only 18%.
Well, you want to tell them that they put a gun beside their head with 1 out of 5 bullets in it and pull the trigger and see how many of them would do that.
Well, that's exactly right. And so, I think in all of our discussion about this, we don't want to be alarmists. We don't want it to create panic, but we do want to be saying to the government of the day, are you taking every step possible to assure us, consumers, producers, people who are in jobs and businesses related to agriculture, are you rock solid that what you're doing is going to ensure that that 18% doesn't transpire? And at the moment, I just don't think we are. Now, what is the next step? Well, I think at the very minimum, it is ensuring that the steps we're taking are being done properly and consistently and on every flight and with every passenger who comes in. And we're 3 weeks in, 3 weeks.
Yep. So the next thing that a few people raised, Susan, that became an interesting one was obviously, and you might correct me if my facts are wrong here because they absolutely could be, but my understanding is that we have trade agreements with a lot of the countries we export our meat to. And a part of those trade agreements have in those contracts that we are a disease-free country. And then obviously if we then all of a sudden have the disease, those exports probably can't happen and have to either go back to being negotiated or at least the whole system comes to a grinding halt. And we saw what happened with a live export, how that played out. So my question is there's obviously the keep this out, which is our number one priority, to keep it out and control and eradicate it in Indonesia if we could. But are we also taking proactive measures to say, righto, if this thing gets in, how do we keep our exports going and keep those markets open as quick as we possibly can? Because my guess is once you go back to, let's say, a country like China, that there's been some political tensions, it could end up becoming a political thing for them not to renegotiate those contracts. So I suppose my specific question, to be very direct, is are we taking massive action towards making sure we can keep our markets open if it does get in?
So to negotiate a trade agreement currently takes at least 2 years. So those discussions would be commencing right now as to what does that look like if we were to have to talk about having a disease incursion in Australia. We know how it played out for Brazil. They lost market access. They regained market access, but not at the premium prices that they were receiving before. So this will be a process that's been undertaken by the Trade Department. I can't tell you how advanced that is, and certainly I'll take that back and ask some questions when I'm in Canberra next week.
And I think the point is, I suppose, from my point of view, is just that it would seem very practical and common sense to go, there's a two-pronged approach. We don't want to wait till it arrives and then all of a sudden go, oh, sorry, now we can't export, because that's cataclysmic for everyone, because our cattle aren't going to be able to be exported, and also too we're going to lose the revenue, and when we can't really afford with the current levels of debt we've got, etc.
Yeah, and look, that also raises the issue of, let's say, happily we don't get foot and mouth and lumpy skin disease into the country. But if it is ravaging Indonesia and we've got a plan to be shutting down live export, that's not a good plan, is it? And so I'll certainly be raising that with the Agricultural Minister and the Labor government, is that, they've announced that they want to bring live sheep exports to an end. I assume that live cattle is next. This is something that they need to be seriously thinking about, supplying food to our near neighbours. This is why we have a live cattle export. This is why we have a live sheep export, because we export into markets that don't have electricity, have religious requirements, just don't have enough cattle of their own or sheep of their own to feed their population. So for all those reasons, we need to be ensuring that we're not making decisions now in a framework that will change for them as they treat their own animals.
Yeah, and I think it's very arrogant of us to overlay our values and potentially do something that impacts some of the poorest people in the world who are struggling, as you said, who don't have electricity, who are struggling to survive and feed their families. I think we all also need to keep that in the back of our mind, that we care about our neighbours and we want to show that we care about our neighbours. So we should be making sure that they've got full bellies and they can feed their kids. Yeah. I think that's a really important point that I'd hope that the people involved would think that way, if you know what I mean.
Well, I think we can also, as Australians, feel very proud of the work we do on live export ships and through that supply chain. It is incredibly unfortunate that it was politicised, and Animals Australia and some of those activist groups took footage, sometimes not from Australian cattle, sometimes not from our own supply chains. We worked really hard as a nation and as an industry to fix shortcomings in our supply chains, to do exactly what you've just said so well, which is to feed some of the poor and the nations that are particularly in our geopolitical world. So the work that's been done means that we have a really incredibly high standard for live exporters. And in fact, one of the things we do when we export our animals is that we export animal welfare standards as well. We've exported standards. We provide money to upgrade their equipment, to train their workforce. These are things that would not happen if Australia was not in this space. And so, some of these activist groups who, to be clear, don't believe in farming animals in any form, have run a very strong campaign against live export. It's made a lot of Australians worried, and I understand that, but I would encourage them to, make the effort to go onto Livestock Collective, to go and visit a live export ship or a place and see for themselves, or even if they go to Indonesia and Bali and ask, do you like receiving Australian meat, and see what sort of response you get then, because it's something that I think we should be very proud of.
I remember when there was I was actually over in Asia when I think it was the $5 co-payment for going and seeing a doctor was coming out, and there was a furor on that. And I remember I said to the gentleman that was driving us around for the day, and I said to him, this is the problem we've got in Australia at the moment. They're asking people to pay $5 for this, to go see the doctor. And his words to me was, I'll swap you.
Yeah.
And he just spent 2 years with his dad at home dying of cancer with no medical treatment and no pain relief. And he said, I would give anything to have that. So I think we have to sort of look at this problem from we've got it pretty good compared to many people in the world. But you brought up an interesting point, and this was one that, again, I had the conversation with a few people about this, and it was around the activists. And I don't want to make this all about the problem, but there is an element of the activists, climate or animal welfare activists in the government, in the corporate media, and throughout society. And they believe that meat production is bad from both an ethical and environmental point of view. And so I think there's a lot of unease from producers that there's the potential that they could see this as a good way to be able to shut down the meat industry. So my question is have you seen any of that sort of stuff politically happening yet? And if you do, how do we call that out? Because I think it's a major problem.
Very happily, I've not seen that around foot and mouth and lumpy skin disease. And I assume it's because they understand that the consequence for animals getting those diseases into the country are, really terrible, not just for the farmers and graziers and the consumers, but for the animals themselves. So I would think in all good conscience, nobody would want to see that happen. But we do have to be very aware that there is a very well-educated, well-resourced group of people who are running campaigns against animal production, against mining, and often they're the same people. And so, when I talk to industry groups, I talk about remembering that the things we do are so important to humans and civilization and the way we live. And so we have got to be careful not to ever let ourselves be divided and conquered, So rangelands farming graziers shouldn't be critical of live exporters, and in the same way that miners shouldn't be critical of coal miners if they're a hard rock miner, because it is just a way of driving a wedge into an industry, trying to make things more difficult for one part, but it actually is an attack. They will never stop. They'll never stop until they see the end of animal production, if it was up to them. I chaired a meat definitions inquiry recently, and it was fascinating because we had scientists and doctors, all sorts of people come and give evidence. And one of them that I found was really interesting is that you can take a plant-based protein product, you can put in all the vitamins and other things that make it look nutritionally equivalent to a meat product, but the human body has been evolving over hundreds of thousands of years, and what it needs is to take its nutrition from animal-based protein, and that's what we do really well on. And so this equivalency thing I thought was really important, and not just the fact that so much of our animal production is done on land that's not suitable for crop production. So this idea that you could take away cattle and sheep and equally, grow pulses or vegetables on the same land is patently ridiculous. And I think that's been lost on people who think that, soil is soil is soil, and you can grow animals or you can grow crops, or worse, that you could just shut it up and leave it vacant.
Yeah, and it seems to me that, you mentioned something before which struck a chord, was talking about we're under-resourced with people who have, for example, you gave the vets. And I think because it's been such a long time, because since we've had anything like this, you mentioned the brucellosis and the TB, I think it was, most of those people will have retired that have been through that.
Yeah.
So we've had, it's like economically, we've had an absolute miracle run from a biosecurity, from an agriculture point of view, from a pretty much everything, that nobody's ever had to go through any of these major problems. So the people that are potentially in the departments or in the organisations haven't seen, the mobilisation of the plans before. And so we've lost all those resources, whether they've retired or left the industry or done something else. Is that a fair point, that we've lost all those people, do you think?
I think we don't have the people who've been on the front line in Australia. There are still active vets who went to the UK in 2001, so I think we've got that experience. And I guess too, I should make the point that the fact that we haven't had disease outbreaks hasn't just been by good luck. The fact that we don't have African swine fever in the country has not just been by good luck. We have actually worked incredibly hard on screening systems for people bringing food again into the country. That is the one thing that I would love to see us really focus on, is say no. You can't bring grandma's best salami recipe, product into the country, because that is a high risk. And that's why we scan food post. The machines that scan post for biological products, they're working overtime. We've got sniffer dogs in lots of the airports, just looking for those things. So, very happily, we don't have too many people who've lived through an outbreak, except for those who've been offshore to see it. But it hasn't all been by good luck. I should acknowledge that there has been, I'm sure, a lot of sleepless nights for biosecurity officers as they, do detect somebody bringing in, ham sandwiches, for goodness sake, How mad are people?
Oh, absolutely. And look, and I think that you make a very good point, is there's a lot of people working their butts off at the moment. And I just want to make sure that, we acknowledge the fact that there are a lot of good people working very hard, probably having very sleepless nights. I just hope that from a country point of view, we can have someone who's effectively like a commander-in-chief that'll take charge and be in control and responsible, and will execute the plans and be able to look us all in the eye and say, we've done absolutely everything we can. That's what I think would be lovely to see, and it would give people a lot of confidence knowing that was the case. Because if you do everything you possibly can, you've got a solid plan, you execute everything brilliantly, there's, as you said, still a 1 in 5 chance that it gets in. And so it's a failure of sorts, but it's not really. So from your point of view, what can the average producer do to help? Because I can see I've noticed that you're working your butt off. You understand, you come from a grazing background, so you understand the importance. You've been in the meat industry yourself, owning the chain of butcher shops. What can the average person do to, I suppose you'd say, contribute to the effort? What would you suggest anyone does?
Well, I think the most important thing we can do is continue to keep the pressure and the sense of urgency on the people who make the decision. So write a letter to the Prime Minister's office, to Albanese's office, to the Agriculture Minister's office, to the Trade Minister. Just drop them a note saying, I want you to know that I am very, very concerned, and I need you to be able to assure me that we're not going to get these diseases into the country. And if you have any thought that maybe, we'll be dealing with it here, then I need you to work harder and do more, throw more resources, more people, more scanning machines, more disinfectant pads as people are coming into the country. There is no effort that we can do now that won't look incredibly cheap in time to come if it gets into Australia.
Far cheaper to stop it getting in than deal with it once it's here.
That's exactly right. And then the other thing they can do is encourage other people to do the same. And that's what I'm saying. I'm asking people to get in touch with the decision makers who are, holding the keys to the kingdom and making the decisions about what resources are put to this. The Agricultural Minister says he has a two-pronged approach. Well, it's not enough for me to hear that he is passionate about this and he's talking to the department every day. I want to know that he's seen the flyer, that he's asked how many people have walked across disinfectant pads, that he feels that he understands completely what announcements have been made in planes, what billboards are up in front of airports. I think we're quick to do an app these days, but there's nothing like a good sized poster as you come on and off a plane saying no food. No food, here's the bin, clean your shoes, some really basic things. And that's what I'm just worried that they're not asking, to that level of detail and being assured that that's what we're doing. I think we do have to walk a line about being alert and not alarmed. And being alert means having a farm biosecurity plan. What does that look like? Do you have one? And if you don't, to contact your peak ag body and ask them. That they must have a pro forma that you can start working through and understanding what does that look like. Does it mean you don't let people onto the property? That you ask them, have you been overseas? Can I remind you? Please give it 7 days before you come out to us. It means that if you've gone to Bali yourself, that you think about when you go home, don't go and hose off your sneakers in the yard, They're kind of the same practical measures that as graziers and farmers that we expect everybody else to take, making sure that we're taking the same steps ourselves.
And I think that's an important point. And I think the farming community has always been really good at looking after themselves. They've been very resilient, very proactive, and we've slipped into a society these days, I fear, that we're always looking for the government to save us, whereas I'm not suggesting we let the government off free on this in any way, shape or form, but the sensible person would try and do whatever they can to safeguard their family, their industry, their community. And if I look at the ag industry, it's very fractured. There's dozens or probably hundreds of industry organisations out there, not one voice. And I think if everyone can get in there to their organisation, however small, and find a way that they can, like you said, write to the Minister, the Department of Trade, the Prime Minister, whoever it might be. But I also think maybe, reaching out to the influencers out there, to the young kids, I think that might be something good for me to do, is to reach out to some people with some big audiences in the younger generation and talk about this issue and say, look, you might think it's an agricultural problem, but if this gets in, this could mean your job. This could mean your livelihood. This could mean that you're out of a job because there's a knock-on effect. And also, you may not be able to afford food because it gets so expensive, and starting to educate people. Yeah,
I think that's exactly right. Knowledge is power, and then making sure that we hold the people who are accountable and responsible to account. They're doing what it is that we're paying them to do, and that we feel confident that they are doing everything that they say they are, because there's lots of good intentions, but that's just not quite enough to mean that people can sleep easy at the moment.
Yeah, and there was two things I used to say in my business. The first one is do your damn job. That's what I used to say to anyone I dealt with. I just want you to do your job. No more, just do your damn job.
Yep.
That was the main one. And the second one was follow up, follow up, follow up. Like make sure people are doing their job. And I think that's what we need to do here is just keep the pressure on, hold their feet to the fire, so to speak, in a polite, constructive, professional manner.
Yep.
And if we all do that, then we'll start to row the boat in the right direction. And I think the reality is there's no easy fix. No one has the simple solution. And yeah, I just think put that pressure on, like you said, just that gentle pressure to make sure people do their job.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Keep it simple. If everybody does what they're expected to do, and what's the other one? The standard that you walk past is the standard you accept. And, if you get off a plane and nobody checked you, well, I hope you're telling someone, that's not good enough. But, very happily, I spoke to a mate in the live export industry yesterday who told me that he arrived back, every person, the sniffer dog, walk past. He obviously is concerned about, where he'd been, so he made a particular point about asking to be checked. But, for those people who may not think that they've actually been in contact with a farm animal, they're the ones who inadvertently, through no ill intent, just need to be alerted to the risk that as a nation we have, and that's the government's responsibility. Posters on the wall, disinfectant mats as they walk in. I don't think we can overdo it because we've talked about foot and mouth. There's lumpy skin disease. There are all sorts of biosecurity risks that Australia wants to keep out. And just the fact that, we've had, years where you can get your passport, book a ticket online, be on a plane the next day and be pretty well anywhere in the world very quickly and then come back. We are a very mobile world. This is the thing that I think has changed, since 2001 with the UK, and we are increasingly mobile. We're increasingly disconnected from agriculture and the places that it comes from. And so our thoughts about risk and biosecurity risk, I think, are just getting less and less. When I was a kid, I remember going overseas and they walked down the plane with 2 tins of, Mortein or Peebo or something. I'm sure it was probably
It's probably DDT.
DDT, exactly. It's very bad for you. But, there was a very physical reminder of why we cared about biosecurity in this country and what we were prepared to do about it. I think we've let that go, and that's a shame because, that physical reminder is incredibly important. Most Australians, I think, would do the right thing, but the fact that we are still finding people bringing undeclared food products into this country means that there are people who are knowingly not doing the right thing. And so we can't rely on goodwill. We can't rely on common sense. We have to have very, very strong physical barriers to disease of all sorts coming into this country. And it's foot and mouth today. It'll be something else tomorrow. We need to continually work on those programs. And as well, I always talk about feral pigs, so I'm just going to do that again. We still have people who are dropping earless pigs out into national parks and, because we want to kill them in the crops, but we would still like to be able to hunt them on weekends. I mean, we have to get serious about the risks, particularly in Northern Australia where I'm from. We have to be focused on the biosecurity risks that we've got up there and all do our bit, exactly as you say.
Yeah, yep. For the lack of a better example, if we can't do the basics, we're not going to be able to do the complicated stuff. So focus on the basics, get the basics right, and that's going to be the old 80-20 rule. You'll get 80% of your results from 20% of your effort. So focus on those 20%, get that at least working well, and you can say we've done all that.
Yeah.
So yeah, look, I'm very conscious of your time. It's been a really good conversation. It's highlighted a few things for me, answered a few questions. I think it's given people things to do. My takeaway from this is that anyone that's involved in an industry association should share this podcast or at least talk to the people in control, write to their organisation and hold people accountable. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we sign off?
Look, I think meat consumption in this country has fallen dramatically. I'd go and have a steak and or a lovely lamb chop or something, and continue supporting the industry. Continue talking up how great Australian agriculture is, and why would we should care about it. It's certainly worthwhile. You could probably match it with a craft beer, made from Australian wheat, or a lovely glass of wine, because we are so fortunate in this country, and there is nothing that we shouldn't do to protect it.
Absolutely. I think that's a great sentiment. So thank you very much for today. I appreciate it. And hopefully everyone will share this around and we'll get the message out. I appreciate your time and I appreciate the significant effort you're doing, and hopefully this helps.
And the same to you, Ben. We're all part of the solution. Thank you.
This is an important topic, and I genuinely appreciate Susan taking the time out of her busy schedule to speak with us here at the Financial Bloke podcast. As I said in the intro, Susan's working bloody hard at improving FMD awareness, and I want to support her efforts. To do that, I'm going to ask if you could please share the episode with everyone you know, and also, if you're a member or involved with any industry associations, ask them to share it with all of their members, and also get them to write to all of the appropriate government departments to put the appropriate amount of pressure on. We need to be as vocal as we can, and sharing this podcast will help us do that. Now that's it for this week. Thanks for investing your time, and I'll be back with the next episode in 2 weeks.